Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm Elle. It is hard to overstate the impact of male violence and domination. In some sense, it is the primary force that shapes all of our lives. Or maybe I should say distorts all of our lives. So much so that we can't, in our wildest, most utopic imaginations of peace and love, imagine a world in which male violence and domination is not shaping our reality. From random acts of violence to domestic abuse to porn and rape culture to wars to terrorism and all the societal machinery that is built as a result, from the domestic violence industrial complex to the prison complex to police to military to dictatorships. So how do we unpack and tease apart the ingredients that go into the making of men and male culture of dominance that we all suffer under? How do we shake up and push for a cultural shift away from violent domination? In this episode, I talk with world-leading researcher and educator Michael Flood, who has spent his life doing exactly that, researching, writing, and discussing masculinities, male violence, sexuality and gender, and maybe most importantly, violence prevention for men and boys, and doing the work of creating alternative masculine narratives to the dominator one. The subject of our discussion was meant to be kind of narrow, answering the question, what makes men join violent extremism? But as you'll hear, the overlap between the conditioning that draws men to violent extremism and the mainstream conditioning that makes up modern masculinity is really great. So we went where the conversation took us. Hope you enjoy. You research a phenomenal amount of angles and subject matters within masculinities. Today, we're going to talk mostly about violent extremism. And partly why I wanted to focus on it is because we're having so many events across the world, not just in the US, most recently the Charlie Kirk assassination, but even so in New Zealand and Norway and far-flung places. But of course, it's tied into how men are raised and conditioned more broadly. And so actually, let's backtrack a little bit. I'd love to know a little bit about how you got into this line of research.
I've had the privilege of being involved in work on men and masculinities for 30 years, over 30 years. And really, I got involved through an orientation towards social justice. I was running around in my teens with two kind of narratives. I wanted to change the world and I wanted to be a good person. And so I got involved in the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, this was in the late 80s, and was having contact with feminist women and starting to encounter gender issues there. I had some sense of distance from traditional masculinity, from traditional Australian kind of blokey, sexist masculinity. When I was at university, I was exposed to feminist ideals in sociology and other disciplines. I gravitated towards left-wing student politics, and feminist women were the backbone of the group in which I was involved. And so I and other men were being called on our sexism. I was going out with feminist women and had friendships with feminist women and so on. For some reason, I joined a men's group, an anti-sexist men's group, and that was a quite intense involvement over a couple of years of meeting for 2.5 hours every second Tuesday and exploring a whole range of personal topics. So through a series of involvements, quite young, through my late teens and early 20s, I developed a fascination for issues of gender and sexuality and a kind of growing commitment to a pro-feminist politics, and that's stayed with me ever since, both as an advocate and educator and eventually as an academic. I eventually did a PhD and now work in a university, but I continue to play a role not only as a researcher, but as an advocate and educator.
You make this whole arena of masculinities research very accessible through your website, XY.
URL is xyonline.net. But yeah, look, it began as a printed magazine, actually. So it was this
Oh, okay.
pro-feminist magazine that I put out with the men's group I'd first become part of. There was this defunct anti-sexist newsletter in the city I lived in Australia. We took it over and expanded it into a quarterly pro-feminist magazine, and we put that out for about 7 years. And it was similar to the US magazine Changing Men or the UK magazine Achilles Heel. These were these kind of anti-sexist or pro-feminist magazines in the 90s. But by about 1997, we were running out of steam and we folded the magazine and it became a website. And it now exists, XY now exists as a major kind of library or clearinghouse of materials on men and masculinity, not scholarly materials, but materials for educators, for advocates, for parents, for anyone interested in questions of men, masculinities, and gender.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource. I use it a lot. And it's so broad, it's about fatherhood or domestic violence or all kinds of areas of study or knowledge. I read your book, which was based on several studies called Masculinities and Violent Extremism. You also authored another book called Engaging Men and Boys in Violence Prevention. And I do want to try to get to that as well. But can you tell me a little bit how you and your co-author, what the impetus was for the studies and the book that became Masculinities and Violent Extremism?
So across the two areas you've mentioned, the prevention of domestic and sexual violence and responses to violent extremism, there's been this important shift, and it's a shift that has occurred across a number of other social issues too, which is a recognition of how masculinity is implicated in these social problems. And by masculinity, I simply mean the attitudes, values, and behaviours expected of men and boys. In the violent extremism field, there's been growing recognition that most of the people who perpetrate violent extremism are men. That is, most members of violent extremist groups are men. And more importantly, that what it means to participate in violent extremism, the way that people are recruited into violent extremism, and the ideologies that violent extremist groups themselves use are all shaped by masculinity in various ways. I should also hasten to add, when I say violent extremism, I'm again defining that broadly. And so violent extremism can exist across the political spectrum, from the extreme right to the extreme left, can include white nationalist and white supremacist groups on the far right, can include radical socialist groups on the left, can include Islamicist groups, and so on. But across that spectrum, there's been growing recognition in the countering violent extremism space that we need to address masculinities as part of this work. It was a particular state government department in Australia that approached my colleague Joshua Roose and myself about writing a report on the links between masculinity and violent extremism. And so we were initially commissioned to review literature on this area and also to conduct some original analysis, to collect some quantitative and qualitative data from among men themselves in Victoria, in one of the states and territories in Australia, and also to do some analysis of the kinds of content visible on violent extremist websites online. And so, working with three others, Joshua Roose and I did that report, and we've since then turned that into a book, which was released in 2022. And one of the things I'm really interested to see in looking at more recent scholarship on violent extremism is many of the insights and themes that we were tentatively posing in some ways in that book have now received further support, further corroboration about the ways that masculinity is implicated in violent extremism.
I just want to point out too that violent extremism, what we're talking about here is like the non-state kind. To my mind, there's quite a bit of overlap in belief systems, rhetoric, conditioning, etc., between, mainstream, so much of what we're seeing on the nation state level. I'm thinking specifically about Donald Trump or the Trump administration. So I just want to, make that connection also.
No, and that's a very good point. And If we look at the violent extremism field, there's a whole range of examples where, in fact, collective violence and repression by states fits definitions of violent extremism, but is ignored or condoned in that scholarship. And there's certainly some versions of violent extremism in some countries and contexts that are clearly involve state terror rather than non-state actors. I should say my expertise is less on violent extremism and more on masculinity. And in bringing Joshua Roose and I together to write this book with three others, really it was combining his expertise on violent extremism and my expertise on masculinity and specifically on interpersonal violence, domestic and sexual violence. So while I'd say that I now know something about violent extremism in the area, I know less than people whose research is dedicated to that area.
Yeah, but you know a lot about masculinities and masculine conditioning, and I think those are very sort of woven together in the book, certainly.
There was a kind of simplistic and emerging literature on how masculinity was implicated in violent extremism at the time that we were putting the book together. And certainly one of the things that the book does is criticize some of those explanations because of their simplicity. So, for example, one of the claims made in some literature was that it's really kind of cultural alienation that drives some men's participation in violent extremism, that multiculturalism fails and young Muslim men, for example, feel a sense of cultural alienation in Western countries, and that draws them to violent extremism. Now, the evidence for that is in fact very weak. And among young Muslim men in some studies, what was much more significant than any sense of alienation was direct experiences of police brutality and police violence and anti-Muslim discrimination rather than some generalized sense of alienation. Likewise, another explanation that's sometimes offered in the literature is disaffection with government, young men experiencing violence by the state and responding violently to that. Now, there's some truth in that, but it's also the case that some violent extremist groups are linked to the state, as we've already said, are linked to the state and sponsored by or condoned by the government. Another factor that's sometimes identified is economic frustrations, that many men have grown up with the expectation that they will be the breadwinner, that they will be the primary money earner in their families in contexts of growing economic inequality and economic precarity. Some men are unable to live up to that social expectation, and that plays out in frustration. Again, there's mixed evidence there. There's some evidence that, in fact, it's not poverty that's associated with violent extremism. It's some of the men who participate in violent extremism are relatively economically secure. Again, employment has an uneven relationship to violent extremism. So there's grains of truth in various of the explanations that we encountered, but there's also simplicity in there. And the last one that I'll mention is the notion of toxic masculinity. It's not a phrase I like very much, but it's a phrase that refers to one particular rigid model of how to be a man based on being tough, being stoic, being rigidly heterosexual, being in control, and so on. And there's certainly some evidence that particular versions of masculinity are celebrated and actively used in recruitment in some violent extremist groups. But we point out that some versions of this explanation themselves are weak, because the most common version of the explanation we could see was a version that stereotypes Muslim men as all, rabidly sexist and violent and primitive, and sort of uses these kind of blunt racist stereotypes of Muslim men to explain some Muslim men's participation in violent extremism. Those explanations ignore the ways that masculinity also is central to, white supremacist extremism in the US and other forms of violent extremism.
Yeah, no, I think toxic masculinity is one of those terms that's just like such a jargon or label that oversimplify what we're talking about and prevent you from digging deeper into various things. You do say throughout the book that it's not one scenario. It's not one circumstance. It is, each case is different. There are commonalities, but there are variations.
That's true. And look, there are some important commonalities. And we pointed to some emerging evidence of the links between misogyny, so a particularly blunt or hostile form of sexism, and political violence. And so just to explain, I think the term misogyny increasingly is used in somewhat kind of slippery or broad ways. So we mean by misogyny a subset of sexism, a subset of pro-patriarchal attitudes and behaviours that is more intensely hostile and blunt in its content and in its impacts. We did find, and there's growing research, in fact, corroborating this more and more, that having hostile sexist attitudes, particularly blunt and pro-patriarchal attitudes towards women and gender roles, is an important predictor of support for violent extremism, often more important than religiosity, for example, more important than age, more important than education. So hostile sexist attitudes or misogynist attitudes are an important predictor of support for and involvement in violent extremism. And in fact, there's a direct link between men having used violence against women and used terroristic violence. So the men who hit the front page of the paper for mass shootings or for other forms of public violent extremism often have personal histories of domestic and sexual violence. And so there's significant overlaps between hostility towards women, violence towards women, and violent extremism more generally. And in fact, some people have described misogyny as a kind of early warning sign. In studies from both Islamist and far-right groups, misogyny is an early warning sign of risks of violent extremism.
What do you connect that to? If you were analysing that, why is that? What does it mean?
What it's partly about is what you might think of as a common psychology. And there's a really interesting paper that just came out this year pointing to the factual links, the empirical links between misogynistic attitudes on the one hand and sympathy for and involvement in kind of violent extremist or terrorist acts on the other, that both of those, both domestic violence and violent extremism, share a common psychology. Efforts to exert power and dominance and control through fear and violence, a kind of foundation of patriarchal gender roles. And so there are links there in terms of hyper-masculinity, so a kind of an extreme support for stereotypical masculine gender roles. There are links in terms of what you might think of as a kind of collective narcissism, that among the men who perpetrate domestic violence and the men who perpetrate violent extremism, part of this shared psychology is a sense of a kind of group-based entitlement. We are exceptional, we are special, we are entitled to special recognition and privileged treatment, but we're not getting it. We're not being recognised by others. And a third dimension of that shared psychology is revengefulness, an orientation towards revenge, towards payback. So the paper I'm thinking of actually documented this common psychology in a kind of large-scale study, finding that misogynistic attitudes and condoning of violence against women and a willingness to use violent extremism were associated among men, but not among women. Even among women who were relatively condoning of violence against women, prepared to blame the victim, excuse the perpetrator, they didn't show that same association with violent extremism, but men did. And so this paper, at least, and certainly other research, points to some common ideological and psychological dimensions to men's personal violence against women and acts of violent extremism.
So like valorization of manhood or masculinity, aggrieved entitlement, could you call it?
Yeah, exactly. And kind of hyper-masculinity or kind of deeply patriarchal gender roles. Men must be head of household, men's decisions must come first, women are second-class citizens, women are only good for raising children, or, those kinds of notions. Women are certainly seen, in some violent extremist ideology as having a very important place. They're put on pedestals, but they're put on pedestals in deeply paternalistic and benevolently sexist ways. They're kind of raising the children of the nation and so on. So, there's a number of common dimensions there that you and I collectively have mentioned.
I wanted to jump back to some of the assumptions that you try to debunk in the book too, about this idea of the lone wolf violator, that they act in a vacuum and that they're alienated, like you said, from society. But it's actually the very, very opposite, what you're finding, isn't it?
I think one key point to make is that the attitudes towards gender and masculinity that inform acts of public violence, for example, are in fact shared more broadly and are tied in various ways to relatively common beliefs about gender, about masculinity, and so on. In other words, the misogyny that is visible among some perpetrators of violent extremism doesn't come purely out of their heads. It, in fact, is built into our culture in important ways. And there are continuities between the kind of misogynist attitudes towards gender or understandings of gender visible in violent extremist groups and the attitudes that are present in the population more broadly. Now, I'm not saying that the vast majority of people in Australia or the US or other countries subscribe to the kind of explicitly misogynist attitudes that are visible among many violent extremist groups, but substantial minorities of people do so. And so part of our book was a survey of, I think it was 450 men and interviews with about 50 men, again in the state of Victoria. And what we found was that certainly bluntly sexist or patriarchal views were not majority views. Most men support gender equality. Most men agree with basic feminist ideals about women and men's rights and opportunities. However, there were significant minorities who, for example, felt that feminism had gone too far, that women were now getting unfair advantages, and men were increasingly the victims of women or the victims of feminism. So that was visible, for example, among some young men, and among some older men in Australia. There were also hostile racist views that will readily feed into various kinds of white supremacist violent extremism. And in fact, we highlighted in particular what we called the silent 5%. A 5% or so of men, so 1 in 20, who are strongly opposed to women's rights, have little trust in institutions or politicians, feel insecure or unstable about their own jobs, their own income, see minorities as undermining or threatening national unity, and, importantly, who think that violence can legitimately be used to achieve political change. So there was this kind of consistent minority, 5%, 1 in 20 men from this research, who...
Significant.
Yeah, that's right, who had a cluster of beliefs that we felt made them vulnerable to violent extremism. And since then, I've looked at a range of other forms of data. And, there's growing attention in media across a whole lot of countries about the growing gender gap between young men and young women. And in Australia and in other countries, there is a growing gender gap where young men increasingly are either slowing in their support for gender equality or indeed, in the US, for example, moving backwards, declining in their support for gender equality. And a significant proportion of young men, typically around 15 or 20 or 30%, depending on the question, are in fact increasingly hostile to feminism and hostile to women's rights. And that's very troubling in terms of their own likely treatment of women and girls and their potential recruitment into anti-feminist and extremist communities and groups.
Yeah, so it goes quite far beyond just misogyny. It's anti-feminist, and that's a distinction, I think.
And that's an important one. So, in some ways, I'm frustrated if the term misogyny is used to describe every participant in the manosphere, in the online network of anti-feminist groups and networks that people are paying greater attention to. The manosphere refers to a kind of an ecosystem of anti-feminist groups online. Typically, it's seen to include men's rights advocates, men going their own way, MGTOW, pickup artists, and incels. And incels have attracted particular attention lately, partly because of some high-profile incidents of homicide by incel-identified men. And the term misogyny is sometimes used for those groups in a simplistic way. I think there's clearly misogyny there, but some of those men will say, oh, no, we don't hate women. We just want women to, fulfill their natural roles as mothers or breeders and so on. So I think we have to be careful around the language we use to describe what are definitely pro-patriarchal, anti-feminist groups and networks.
But anti-feminist connotes something different, like that they are against the gains that feminism might make.
Absolutely. And as you said, these are not radically isolated abnormal beliefs. They're held by significant minorities of men and indeed smaller, but still significant minorities of women.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the violent extremist narratives of masculinities that has such broad appeal to men. The whole idea of the male as the protector, casting men as protectors of a tribe. You write about that, men having maybe lost status in as far as they're concerned, lost status, and that they kind of cast back to a former time where they were protectors of the tribe, sort of warriors engaged in an existential battle and so forth, and
Yes.
that's very attractive to a certain population.
Yeah, look, we identified a series of narratives of masculinity that are visible across a range of violent extremist groups. And you've summarized two of those very well. So one was the male protector, in which men are called on to protect their family, their community of faith, or their nation. And there's this notion of the kind of threat to the nation by the dangerous masculinities of kind of racialized other men, that kind of thing. So the male protector narrative, the narrative of restoring a lost patriarchal order, that violent extremism is the only way to bring us back to, a kind of healthy, desirable patriarchal society. And so in both ISIS, for example, ISIS narratives, and in far-right narratives, there's this narratives of kind of gendered decline, of the moral decline of the West, notions of the great replacement, that white people are being replaced by non-white and ethnic minority people and so on. And there were two other narratives as well. One was an appeal to male potency and virility, kind of fantasies of gloriously violent and righteous men dominating, motifs of the kind of heroic male warrior. And then finally, kind of notions of male suffering, of men as victims, and the notion of the red pill, which is very common in manosphere language, of men, realizing the reality of the situation, that men are now the victims of women and feminism and so on. And I have to say, looking at those four narratives, I was rereading sections of the book last night, and I've been on X, or what used to be Twitter, for some time now, and I felt this kind of sense of shock and disgust last night as I saw just how many of those narratives are being actively pushed by Elon Musk and his colleagues on X. X, or Twitter, has shifted significantly, I would say, in the last few years, where increasingly assertive right-wing and neo-Nazi perspectives are visible on X, I'm very troubled to say. And precisely those narratives of the male protector, of restoring a lost patriarchy, are visible, including being promoted by, the richest man in the world. I just had this sense of shock of, oh my God, here they are.
Out in the open.
Yeah, being elevated en masse to literally millions of people by the person who runs this entire platform.
In fact, it just made me think about this speech that Stephen Miller made. He's an American political operator. He made a speech at Charlie Kirk's memorial service that was literally this narrative of the lost patriarchy and recovering the patriarchal role. We are the builders, we are the warriors, we won't be replaced, we will defend our race.
You could have been ticking off each of those violent extremist narratives as he went. I think that's a very good example of how, particularly in the last few years, there's been a mainstreaming and a normalizing of the narratives that, were less visible previously. And so in another piece, a very recent journal article that Joshua Roose, Vivian Durand, and Debbie Ging and I wrote, we talk about the neo-manosphere. We talk about the shifts in anti-feminist communities and networks online. And one of the important shifts we remark on is the mainstreaming and normalizing of anti-feminist or manosphere narratives in popular culture, and their visibility across a range of other websites, men's health websites and personal growth and pickup artist websites and so on. Social media and a number of other social shifts are facilitating kind of mainstreaming and normalizing of these views. In the book, we then describe some further research we did, where we did two things. We did this kind of digital ethnography, so spending time in and documenting the primary themes and ideologies in a range of violent extremist and far-right and men's rights websites and far-left websites as well, and also doing a quantitative analysis of the words used in those different websites using what's called linguistic inquiry and word count, which is this kind of fancy quantitative methodology of counting the numbers of words that speak to particular forms of emotion, such as anger and so on. One of the things we found that was really interesting was that, in fact, narratives of masculinity are not the same across the political spectrum, that men's rights and far-right and Salafi groups have shared narratives around a kind of militant warrior masculinity, where, it's about trying to reclaim what was lost to feminism, to minorities, to political correctness, and so on. But the far left groups, so the two socialist groups, I think, that were studied in this research, they didn't have anything like these same narratives of masculinity. To the extent they talked about gender and masculinity, they actually supported feminism. They had pro-feminist narratives, and they saw women's liberation or women's emancipation as an important part of their political goals. They didn't talk much about masculinity. They didn't talk much about men's issues, and they certainly didn't position men as victims. So far left groups differed from the other three in terms of how they represent masculinity.
Very interesting. There was another part in the book that I found fascinating, the role and use of emotion to recruit men into groups or movements. I'm just going to quote for a little bit here. Social movements and protest actions succeed best when they provide affective high points. Amplifying political discourse so it's awash with emotion. And you talk about how violent extremist movements harness these certain emotions that draw men. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The dynamics of people's participation in these groups and the dynamics of how people are recruited into these groups and the way these groups can generate public support is not simply ideological. It's not simply about, oh, I agree with that idea, or, oh, I think that that is a fair and an accurate analysis of our social situation. The dynamics are also affective, that is, to do with emotion, to do with emotional responses around anger, around entitlement, around feelings of disenfranchisement, but also feelings of empowerment and so on.
I just think it's an interesting aspect of the whole, trying to figure out what drives this thing is that it isn't just like intellectual concept, it is emotion.
Yeah, and you can see it, go to a Trump rally and, you can see how emotion is front and center. I mean, if it just wouldn't make sense that most Trump supporters are motivated by their appreciation for his articulate expression of an ideological framework. I mean, if you ever listen to the man, that's clearly not what's going on.
No, exactly. I mean, he could be saying nothing at all, but just his emotion that he's transmitting to his listeners is like the thing.
And violent extremist groups and, the Trump administration and a whole series of other much more mainstream political actors and groups trade in emotion as a way to mobilize support. The implication of that is that our efforts to prevent or reduce violent extremist and other forms of pro-patriarchal politics will have to work not only ideologically, but also at the level of emotion.
So how do you go about doing that?
And there's certainly growing awareness in that field, in the CVE, countering violent extremism space, that we have to pay attention to questions of gender and masculinity, that you're often working with groups of men, often young men, and that dynamics of masculinity are central to their participation. Now, one of the most well-established strategies is a kind of face-to-face educational strategy, is working with people who are at risk of participation in these groups because of things they've said or done, or indeed working with those people who are already in those groups and have come to public attention in some way. And some of the work is about providing alternative narratives, providing alternative accounts of masculinity and identity and relationships and so on that will be an engaging, palatable alternative to violent extremist narratives of masculinity. So there's face-to-face educational work, there's kind of exit strategies or exit programs. They began among neo-Nazi groups, for example, in countries in Europe and elsewhere. And again, exit strategies can be used with men in general involved in violent extremism. For example, having educators who themselves have participated in and then left those groups, providing narratives of the benefits of doing so and the shifts in perspective that involved. But there are also broader ideological strategies we need. We need strategies that work at the level of community norms and social norms to try to undermine the kinds of pro-patriarchal and other narratives that feed into personal violence, domestic and sexual violence, and into violent extremism. And finally, so I mentioned educational strategies, I've mentioned communications and social marketing strategies, A third kind of strategy is addressing the structural drivers of recruitment. So, for example, economic precarity and unemployment and so on. Now, in the book, we criticize some versions of this. There have been some countering violent extremist work that, addressing men in, countries such as Pakistan and elsewhere that say, okay, what we need to do is to restore men's place as the head of household. We need to put men back in charge, and that will limit violent extremism. And A, that's unlikely to work, and B, that just compounds existing inequalities that women suffer. And so we're critical of that, but we certainly can, there's not often the political will for this, but structural strategies that address forms of political and economic inequality, state violence, and other structural drivers of violent extremism are also critical.
You do have some other criticism of the current counter-violent extremism initiatives, which I thought was interesting too, that relying on women, building resilience against extremist violence to outsource it to women, or giving women a sort of maternalistic, ameliorating role instead of a fully invested participatory role. What do you think?
Yeah, well, some strands of countering violent extremist work have been complicit in precisely the kinds of sexist social norms that themselves shape violent extremism. And so whether it's positioning women as the kind of saviors of communities or lumping responsibility for addressing violence and masculinity only on women, there are real problems there. One of the other criticisms we make is the stigmatizing of certain groups of men assumed to be at risk of violent extremism, whether it's in addressing violent extremism or in addressing domestic and sexual violence. We certainly need to avoid approaches to men and boys that are deeply homogenizing or stigmatizing or explicitly racist.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to jump back a little bit to and I like the word you use, the web observations, and digital ethnography and web observations, looking at what's online, what lives online, and as far as this goes.
So that digital ethnography, ethnography is a strategy from anthropology. And in very simplistic terms, it means hanging out in the village and kind of, checking out what's going on and seeing and documenting systematically the typical patterns of behavior, typical attitudes, and so on. And in a sense, that's what this part of this work involved, was hanging out in far right and men's rights and far left websites and seeing what kinds of claims were made, what kinds of narratives were offered about men, about gender, and so on. And what that digital ethnography found was that men's rights groups, so explicitly anti-feminist men's rights groups, and far rights groups both celebrate or valorize a particular version of how to be a man, a particular version of masculinity based in logic, in reason, in conflict, in individualism, strength, and valor. And that was also true broadly among Islamist groups. There were differences, though, across those three, that men's rights and far right organizations positioned men as subordinate, positioned men as now victims. And indeed, I've seen in men's rights rhetoric a language of men as the new Jews or the new N-words, very much a strong belief of men as now systematically disadvantaged by women. That wasn't the case among Islamist groups. There was less belief in a kind of subordinated masculinity and more narratives
because they don't really experience that, do they?
Well, I don't think men do anywhere, actually. I don't think it's plausible anywhere that men are systematically disadvantaged as men. There's certainly groups of men that suffer systematic disadvantage, but they do so as Indigenous men or as gay men or as ethnic minority men, not as men themselves. Although there are some ways in which men in general are constrained by dominant models of masculinity, but to argue that men are oppressed or systematically disadvantaged as men, I think is just pure baloney. But no, there were differences in the narratives, and so Islamist groups didn't have that same narrative as men's rights and far rights groups of men as subordinated by women. They shared with those other groups those kinds of biologically essentialist narratives that, gender roles are set in stone, are driven by biology, and any questioning or departure from them is is an offence to, a religion or is just a biological absurdity.
So if young men or young and old men, I would say, are like moving, like you said, mainstreamed in that direction, Women, I think, are moving, certainly young women are moving in the opposite direction, are asserting their independence even more, even creating their own sort of extreme movements like 4B or others. And so it doesn't look like we're we're heading in each other's direction.
No. And I mean, so in countries like the US, for example, the growing gender gap between young people is in part about young women continuing to move to the left politically and young men moving to the right. In Australia, that's less the case, and young men are also continuing to move to the left. That is becoming more progressive in their views towards gender and gender roles broadly, but they're doing so far more slowly than young women. So in both countries, there's a growing gender gap. That has a number of troubling implications. Certainly for the young men who subscribe to more anti-feminist views, we know that that is implicated in their perpetration of domestic and sexual violence. That is, among boys and men in general, one key risk factor for perpetrating domestic and sexual violence is having explicitly pro-patriarchal and anti-feminist and violence supportive views. So one implication is that this will feed into persistent or growing levels of domestic and sexual violence by young men against young women. Another implication is that this is going to be disastrous for young people's heterosexual relationships. To the extent that young men want relationships with young women and vice versa, there are going to be significant problems where their working beliefs about gender roles and about how women and men should be in the world are increasingly different from each other. You know, it'd be like speaking two different languages. And look, there's not lots of data in Australia about the dimensions of these shifts. There's a bit more data in the US and elsewhere. And certainly there's a little bit of Australian data that suggests that we are starting to see some young men going backwards. There's certainly anecdotal evidence of a spike in a particular kind of explicit sexualized misogyny among some young men. That is, for example, female teachers in Australia are reporting more sexual harassment and more explicitly sexist treatment from their male students than they were getting a decade ago. And it's hard to know what's driving that, but two obvious guesses are participation in the manosphere, that the young men who are saying to their female teachers, make me a sandwich, or, you know, calling them bitches, or making digital fake pornography of their female teachers or female classmates. Some of those young men may be participating in the manosphere where those beliefs are condoned or normalized or celebrated. Some of them may be listening to manfluencers, to anti-feminist influencers like Andrew Tate or a whole cast of others, or there may be other factors going on. Porn may be a factor shaping that increasingly sexualized misogyny among some boys and young men. I think porn is particularly disastrous for young people, and it may be in the domain of sexuality and sexual and intimate relations in particular where things are going backwards among young people. And I think porn is very likely the culprit there. And I've certainly done research on the fact that pornography is a key risk factor for young men's and indeed young women's perpetration of sexual violence and sexual coercion. And for people who are unfamiliar with porn, two things have changed radically in the last 2 decades. One is porn's availability is now ubiquitous, and second, porn's content is much more explicitly violent and degrading than it was. And those two things in combination, I think, are turning porn into a kind of megaphone for patriarchal, sexualized misogyny, not only among young people, but among people in general. I find it troubling that community concern about porn is focused on young people, whereas in fact, it's large numbers of men and smaller numbers of women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s are porn consumers, not just, 16 and 17-year-old boys.
Good point. Good point. I think that point is lost a lot. We're hyper-focused on boys, but it is really a whole big range of men. I think it shapes you, even if you are in your 40s or 50s, it will shape your attitudes in real life to women.
Indeed. That's what the research shows. The research shows that the impacts of porn on attitudes and behaviours are no smaller, or in other words, just as large among older adult users as they are among teenage users. But I don't think that it's all bad. There's certainly some evidence of an increased misogyny among some boys and young men, but there's also positive trends as well. So there's a little bit of data in Australia on young adult men's attitudes to masculinity, so the attitudes of young men 18 to 30. And it shows that most young men don't think that men, have to dominate women, have to be always strong and stoic and in control. Most, in fact, are more accepting of more egalitarian and inclusive models of masculinity, and that's not particularly declined over time. So there is mixed data out there, but there's certainly enough reason to be troubled about where things are going.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to jump to your work in violence prevention, particularly. What is the work there?
2 decades ago and a decade ago, I used to spend lots of my time talking about why we need to engage men and boys in preventing domestic and sexual violence. Now I spend most of my time arguing for how we need to engage men and boys. There's been a significant shift in the violence prevention field where there's now a widespread acceptance that part of our work should be engaging men and boys in change, and that men and boys have a positive role to play as role models in their families, as advocates in their workplaces or sports settings, as political and community leaders, and so on. So in the violence prevention field, we see a growing stream of strategy aimed at boys and men. And the most common strategy is face-to-face education in schools and to some extent in universities. So respectful relationships education or healthy relationships education is a well-established strategy, and increasingly that includes a self-conscious attention to men and boys, whether in mixed gender classrooms or in male-only groups, and a self-conscious attention to the rigid and traditional expectations of masculinity that feed into sexual and domestic violence. And so certainly in Australia and in countries across the world, there are a growing range of initiatives aimed at men and boys. Face-to-face educational programs, some online initiatives, social marketing and communication strategies trying to shift the norms of manhood that feed into domestic and sexual violence, efforts to engage men as faith leaders or religious leaders or community leaders to speak out about domestic and family violence in their communities or to support policies and programming aimed at violence prevention, and a range of other strategies as well. And these complement the work directly with perpetrators of violence in behaviour change programs and complement what is still absolutely vital form of work, which is responding to victim survivors of violence, the women, the children, and indeed the men who are victims of domestic and sexual violence.
Thank you for talking with me and sharing with me about these really important initiatives and important areas of study. And we have to obviously work together to not give into the darker forces, so to speak.
I have an activist bent, and I think part of what sustains that is a sense of hope, a sense that change is possible, a sense that it is possible to, make progressive personal and social change. And I consciously try to have circles and communities that sustain that effort, like-minded friends, a vision of the kind of communities and societies we aspire to, and a sense of the values that drive this work. And so I don't want to sound deeply pessimistic because I think it is possible to make change. I think there are good reasons for hope, and there are significant challenges as well.
Yeah. And I also think partnering in modeling, or as a man, I think you have a particular role, of course, but modeling the change is super important. And I really appreciate that part of your work too.
Yeah, and I don't want to pretend that I've got it all right, because that's not the case. And my partner will tell you, she's not here, but we have difficult conversations sometimes about the power and politics and roles between us. And that's part of this work. And I also would say that for me personally, there've been enormous, profound personal benefits in being engaged in this work in terms of how it's informed my relationship, my role as a parent to my 2 children, my friendships, and the communities I'm part of.
That's wonderful.
You probably take this for granted, but I and my progressive colleagues, we are reeling with shock and horror at what's going on in the US, and feel so troubled, not only for what it means for the US, but troubled for what it means for the rest of the world, because what happens in the US has a profound impact on the politics and culture of my country and many other countries. And, I'm deeply concerned about people in the US, but also this is having global ramifications, which are just shocking.
Yeah. Thank you. We are worried, and we're only 9-10 months into his term. We have 3+ years to go, and he's a wrecking ball at the moment.
It's been a blitzkrieg And I use that term self-consciously. In terms of authoritarian movements, it's been extraordinary.
Yeah, and when I first contacted you, it was right after the Charlie Kirk assassination, and that was bad enough. It was in some sense like a propeller for the ICE raids that are now happening. It gave it extra oomph. And so between when we first scheduled the interview and now, things have vastly changed just in this month. We have like 5-6 cities who are under siege, essentially, by the federal military.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, just extraordinary. And I feel like the pace of change is almost every day. There's some new bit of news, some new behaviour, some new act by Trump and the Trump administration that is shocking, that is illegal, that is outrageous, that violates long-standing democratic norms.
And international human rights conventions and, these extrajudicial killings and blowing up of boats that they're doing in the Caribbean. Like, it is so far out. So you and I are talking about violent extremism, but I'm having trouble, separating it in some sense from...
And my wife, Lula, she's very focused on American politics, and she listens to Trump-related podcasts every day. I just can't listen to it. I find it so upsetting and disturbing to be around that I have to step away from it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I almost get panicked. Obviously, I live in the country, so there's that. But also the sort of blatant aggression about it scares me. And I tell you what scares me the most is that his actions, the administration's, the actions of Musk and Miller and all of them, that I feel give license to men all over to kind of take off their gloves, to...
Undoubtedly.
In some way, they are now getting permission to assault, and especially with ICE running around in our city streets, assaulting women and children and elderly and everything else. There's a permission that's now happening all over, and that frightens me more than anything.
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's visible in a certain kind of sneering, aggressive contempt. Actually, it really is a contempt that I think is playing out in some men's everyday treatment of women.
Yeah, like all of the men who have pent-up rage or who have these resentments are now just showing themselves.
I think that's exactly right. It's a license. Yeah, as you said, a licensing. Yeah, it's very troubling. So yeah, Trump is a topic of conversation in this household almost every day.
Is it really?
Yeah, they're not happy conversations at all. No, that's all right. You didn't vote for him, I'm sure. Yeah. Anyway, it's full on. Full on.
Yeah.
But yes, I feel for you and others in the US, because it must be particularly hard to be so literally under siege.
Yeah.
We're watching with horror from the sidelines, and it does have direct impacts in Australia and elsewhere. Well, fight the good fight.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to me about this.
Really nice to chat.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, Elle. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio, cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.